intricacy to that. There's a little bit of nuance, some gray space, and that gray space lives both in the air as well as on the ground. We do envision a future where these drones are moving in a well-planned, in a common way, in something that's predictable, both from the operational planners as well as those people who regulate and care about safety and privacy and those type of things.
Welcome to another episode of the Mapscaping Podcast. My name is Daniel, and this is a podcast for the geospatial community. Today, I'm talking to Daniel Bradshaw from a company called Airspace Link, and these guys are developing a platform that lets communities update drone flight paths in real time. So this is a really interesting idea. It's basically creating highways in the sky that communities can control. I really hope you enjoy the interview. Hello, Daniel. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast today. I've been really looking forward to this conversation because I think what you're doing with drones and the platform you're building is really, really interesting. But before we dive into all that, could you maybe take a moment just to give us a bit of background about yourself and how you got into your work with drones?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me today. And likewise, great name, Daniel. So from one Daniel to another, hello. I've been a geothinker and a geospatial problem solver for upwards to 20 years now. My first work out of college was actually with state and local government. And over the past, 20 years of my career, I suppose, it's been either directly in state and local government or consulting with state and local government. So definitely a large background there. But over the last 8 years or so, I've been working as an engineer and a consultant in retail solutions. And I've also spent a couple of years working in the United States federal contracting space as well. So kind of a broad background of both commercial as well as governmental geospatial engineering, if you will.
Yeah, so it sounds like you've moved around a little bit there, but all sort of broadly based around geospatial. So that's good. You fit right in here with this audience.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what I wanted to talk to you today about was the company that you work for, and it's called Airspace Link. This is just a broad overview, but as I understand it, you're building a web platform that's going to sort of help regulate the movements of drones, or provide almost like a set of traffic rules for drones as they move around. Can you say a few more words about that?
Yeah, as we view the market, we see a lot of the companies and organizations working from the top down to solve the drone delivery or just beyond visual line of sight drone delivery or drone activity in general problem. But we really view it as the reverse. We're viewing this as a bottom-up problem, meaning state and local governments, communities, those are the people that have the best data on the ground, the most real-world data. So we wanted to provide a platform that allowed these organizations, these communities, the people who know what's going on at any given time, any given day, have the most real-time data, a platform to stand on to dynamically update some of the areas that might have some sort of additional consideration when it comes to drone activity. And so we're trying to tackle this both from a real-time and a dynamic map update perspective, as well as a statistical, static, analytical approach as well, so that we can combine the two to provide the best overall view of what's happening on the ground at any given time, so that the FAA can be assured of drone activity is safe, as well as these communities and governments, local governments, can know that drone activity is safe as well.
So just to clarify for our listeners, I think what we're talking about here is almost like a set of traffic rules that we can use in the sky. In the same way that our roads and our streets, they have sharp edges that we know where they start and stop. We're talking about building these same sort of rules for drones in the sky, so we know where they are, so we can regulate their movement a little bit. Am I on the right track?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, our tagline that we like to pitch folks with is providing highways in the skies for safer drone operations. So it's certainly the best analogous that we can come to, because a drone, in reality, if we're thinking about package deliveries moving from point A to point B, And the shortest route is to just fly from point A to point B. It's going to be a straight line. But we know that there's a lot of intricacy to that. There's a little bit of nuance, some gray space. And that gray space lives both in the air as well as on the ground. We do envision a future where these drones are moving in a well-planned, in a common way, in something that's predictable, both from the operational planners as well as those people who regulate and care about safety and privacy and those type of things.
So before we carry on, I just want to say I think it's really interesting when you said earlier about a lot of people are thinking about the drone problem, solving this drone problem. How are we going to deliver packages? Because it feels anyway like we already understand that this is going to be part of the future. It's just a question of when it arrives and what use cases it's applied to. So it feels like we've accepted that. So and everyone seems to be building the biggest, the best, the fastest drone, but you guys really have a bottom up approach. You're starting, well, we need some sort of system. We need to organize this. We need to regulate this in some way. And it's the first company I've ever heard doing that and approaching it like this. But it makes perfect sense that these drones are going to need some rules to operate in the sky.
Yeah, that's right. And when we think about traffic management, we know that as a car is driving down the road, when it gets to this point, it turns right. We know that you can't drive against a one-way street and those type of things. So our federal entities, speaking strictly from the United States perspective, the FAA is interested in providing safe commercial flights. But as we move into the beyond visual line of sight aspect, they want to ensure that those same set of rules and safety regulations are adhered to in the air. But there's kind of this disconnect between federal entities and state and local entities. And we really want to make sure that we can broker that relationship between state and local governments and federal government, as well as the relationship between state and local government and commercial drone service providers, whether that's package delivery or other activity inspections and those type of things. So we absolutely want to make sure that the regulations that are put in place are beneficial for all and safe for all. And that's our primary objective at Airspace Link.
So before we dive into how you make those regulations, how you make those rules, and I guess what we're actually talking about is how you make these dynamic 3D geofences, which are going to regulate and route drones around the place and change throughout time, of course. I think it's really important to note that you're also talking about communication between a lot of different parties there. So it's one thing to have made these assessments, say you cannot fly here during this time because of whatever, but it's okay to go this way. It's really important to communicate that out to everyone. And we're talking about a lot of different stakeholders in this kind of relationship, I'm imagining.
Oh, absolutely. And, in fact, the FAA as a whole is working towards this goal. They have a program known as LAANC, which stands for Low Altitude Authorization and Notification Capability. And historically, authorizations to fly drones or really any sort of aircraft in the air had to go through some sort of approval process. And those approvals could take historically up to 90 days. And the FAA recognized that this really put a hamper on drone innovation, just really innovation overall in this space. And so they've been working towards building a platform that allowed operators to notify the FAA and then receive an approval back within, let's say, 20 seconds. That's the benchmark that I've heard is actually 16 seconds. So definitely a large step from that 90-day window. And so these types of tools and APIs are being put in place at the federal level. And so state and local governments just now need to step up and provide those same types of tools and APIs so that these companies who want to innovate in this space don't feel like they're stepping on any toes, but at the same time, they're also following the appropriate procedures and regulations. And so Airspace Link wants to fill that gap for state and local governments because in a lot of ways, these communities don't necessarily have the talent or the capability to administer and manage these type of systems. So that's where we're stepping in to fill that gap.
Okay, so if I just try and describe a use case the way I see it. Okay, on one side we have a party that wants to fly a drone, deliver a package. Let's say it's someone who's brought something on an e-commerce website and wants to have it delivered. That said, I realize there are 1,000 other use cases for this kind of thing. But let's keep it simple for now. Okay, so I've brought my package from a company. Now it's up to them to deliver it. So the flying the drone, they would shoot a message over to the state, maybe, ask their system, your system, hey, can I have what's the best route for me to fly from point A to point B? You would reply with an API. You would reply back with some waypoints, I'm assuming, and the drone would fly over there, drop off the package, and fly back. That's the kind of thing we're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, with the addition of one additional step. And so I'll just kind of reiterate your state. That company wants to deliver a package, and so they plan an operation, and that operation needs to be approved both really ultimately at the federal level. And so our objective is to take that state and local government data, wrap an API around it, do some analysis on it, and then take some real-time considerations into play as well. Provide that set of waypoints back to the API, or excuse me, via API, and then allow that user to approve that route, at which point it's submitted to the FAA for final approval. Because ultimately, they're the ones that hold the authority to approve this flight. And so once that is then approved at the federal level, then that is safe to fly, and that operation takes place depending on the time window that it was scheduled for.
Okay, so I think we understand now that we have a system that lets us communicate all these different points of data out to these different stakeholders. Now, but I think the interesting thing for the audience listening to this podcast is who decides how these things, how these drones are going to be routed around a neighborhood, through a city, for example. They're based on a certain set of rules. What kind of areas, or who's making these rules? Who's deciding where the no-fly and fly zones are?
Right, absolutely. And, to be frank, that's absolutely a moving target, but we're putting some stakes in the ground and really trying to push the issue forward. And I think as a whole, as we learn and pivot, the community will pivot together. But so I think that's a joint relationship ultimately between, they're the ones that care about how these drones are flying in their communities. The FAA cares about how these drones are flying in the air. And so again, as a relationship broker, so to speak, we want to make sure that all parties are satisfied with the approach that's taken. And we do that by creating a set of analysis on that static on the ground data, and then layering in some real-time data. So I guess I would best answer that question by saying ultimately that data is driven from state and local government data. And so they're the ones who are deciding how these drones are flying within their communities.
Could you give me an idea of what kind of data might be used in this analysis? Because I'm assuming what we're doing here is we're making a risk analysis. We're looking at different areas, different neighborhoods, and saying, okay, it's okay to fly over there at this time, not okay to fly over there at any time, because who knows why? Because because the risk of the drone falling out of the sky is too great. So we don't want to do that. In the same way that we have, roads, cars can't just drive around through public parks because it's too risky. We've decided cars should be on the roads. So could you give me an idea of what kind of data, what kind of rules, what kind of areas might sort of be considered risky or safe?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll answer that question by giving a recent example. So there's a recent town, the town of Tiburon. I'm not sure what state that's in, but this town has opted to adopt an ordinance that says any of the schools, there are 3 public schools in this particular town, that no drones are allowed to fly within 400 feet of the public schools during school hours. And so those school hours have to be defined. And again, how is it these drone logistic companies know and understand this? They need some sort of platform to know and understand this. But it's not just schools; it's things such as hospitals. Hospitals have a very active airspace. They have helicopters landing and taking off all the time. There are other helipads within a city. News locations, for example, have helipads. But there's also just population as a whole. Where are your dense populations? Where are your light populations? What other type of critical facilities on the ground, such as jails and those type of things? Or are there some sort of rules and regulations that guides the right of way that's on the ground. I know that there's an organization in Michigan in the United States that states that no drone can fly over the right of way of major highways and those type of things. So there's all these different dynamics, and I believe that every community is a little bit different. Some communities will have kind of a baseline of just basic rules and regulations, and other complex communities will have very complex rules and regulations. So taking all those into account play a large role in ultimately making that decision on how that route is generated and ultimately flown.
Could you imagine in the future that a government body is stepping in and saying, maybe at the state level, maybe at the country level, saying, "Hey, these are the rules. If you're in Utah, you do this. This is considered safe. This is considered too risky to fly over during these certain times," and just having like a standard set of rules, just like we do in terms of road traffic.
Absolutely. I think there's going to be some definitely basic guidelines happening at all levels of government. From the FAA, they'll establish a set of basic guidelines, but I don't think they have enough information for what's happening on the ground at any given day or any given time to make that call at a very micro or local level. States are somewhere in the middle, and I believe that ultimately the FAA is looking to the states to make some of those guidelines that will determine how the regulation flows down from the state level into local communities. So while that regulation does exist, I believe, and will be established at all levels of government, it's going to be that local government that I think has the final say on what can and can't happen. And I would add, just to this point, consider ordinances. And ordinances are passed at a local government level all the time. Noise ordinances, or hours of operation ordinances, or operating this type of machinery within a proximity. There's all kinds of variety and types of ordinances. And so those ultimately, I think, will drive how drones play a part in each unique community.
Yeah, I guess for me, it's really helpful to think about the way traffic moves around now and the rules we have around that. But at the same time, when you're flying in the sky, there's no physical barriers, right? You can just fly wherever. So if you're talking about taking the quickest route, that might not be acceptable, flying over a neighborhood. But it's that understanding that we wouldn't like it either if cars could go anywhere. If everyone had a four-wheel drive truck and they just drove everywhere, that would be difficult for people to deal with. But I guess that this is kind of the reality that we're talking about in the sky above us.
Yeah, and we part of our system, we create what we call risk islands, and these risk islands are basically more or less hypothetical barriers. I mean, there's no barriers in the sky, but these risk areas exist on the ground, and so they're projected up, if you will, basically from the ground to infinity. And so our objective is to direct these drones around these barriers so that not only are they not flying over them on the ground, but likewise, they're not flying over them in the air. And these barriers also exist at each level of government. The FAA, as part of the LANT system that I discussed earlier, has already defined geographic boundaries known as UAS FM grids. And these grids, as they get closer to an airport, they get closer and closer to the ground, meaning that you can fly from, for example, 0 to 400 feet in uncontrolled airspace. But as you get closer and closer to that airport, those grids push you further and further down, closer to the ground. And so again, there's no physical barriers there, but drone operators need to understand these barriers. And there are rules to help govern this, and it's a requirement for drone operators to understand these things. Our system will play nicely not only with that local data, but also understand what's happening at the federal level with these UAS FM grids, and be able to take all of those points of interest into consideration.
I think it's probably important to mention, at least here, when you say that the drone operators will need to understand them, probably what you're thinking about there is that the drones themselves will need to understand them, because we're talking about, we don't have line of sight. You can't see the drone here. We're talking about drones operating autonomously.
It's true. That is the end goal of both Airspace Link. We're working towards that objective, and really the drone community as a whole, as hardware manufacturers come on board with very complex sensors and understanding how these drones are flying. But in terms of talking about reality today, there are no beyond visual line of sights without particular waivers, and there are regulations, at least in the United States, that governs this. And I'll mention those briefly. There's what's known as Part 107 rules, which basically states that a drone has to be less than 55 pounds and only visual line of sight. They can't fly at night, can't fly over people. They may use a visual observer if it flies out of sight of the pilot. Someone can be down the line keeping an eye on things as well. As well as at the recreational level, you have to register your drone and you have to pass a test. So there are things in place today, even before the drone takes off and has to kind of make some of its own decisions, that these pilots have to be aware of and be registered for and be cognizant of before legally they're allowed to fly.
When I think about autonomous vehicles on the road, for example, I think about vehicles in the future which are going to have highly detailed maps that are constantly being updated and a whole bunch of sensors and programming that allows them to make decisions by themselves. Could you imagine a future where drones are doing the same thing? Obviously, they're going to need maps too. They're going to need some sort of basic understanding about the world. And I think that's probably what we're getting at when we're talking about risk islands and those 3D geofences. So it has this basic understanding of the world, but then still maybe being able to make decisions as it moves around, taking input from these sensors. I realize that's kind of a leap from what we've been talking about, but is this where we're headed?
Absolutely. I believe that drones are actually quite sophisticated today. Even your off-the-shelf or the shelf personal drone has a complex set, oftentimes, of front of drone sensors, side sensors, back sensors, bottom sensors. Basically, this drone can more or less keep itself from crashing into anything. And at any time, if that drone loses connection with its operator, it knows how to basically extend up to a preset amount, fly across, avoid any trees that are in the way, for example, and then come back down in a nice, safe, and controlled manner. So those tools exist, and there are companies and other organizations who have interest in this space that are conducting experiments on how many drones can you shove into a tube, for example. It's a hypothetical tube, but consider if you have 50 drones trying to fly through the same space, how much area around each of those drones realistically need to exist before they start crashing into each other and falling out of the sky. And these simulations are being run now, and so people are thinking about this problem, and it's becoming a very sophisticated set of hardware that's taking off and making these operations happen. And I would say also that with the advent of 5G, it's a very fortuitous time for the drone ecosystem as well, because these 5G cards are being placed inside of the drones, and so they can have a very high bandwidth, low latency communication with ground controls. And so it's a good time for all of these pieces of hardware and systems to come together at the same time to really make this a reality.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of Internet of Things companies that are really excited about 5G because you don't have that latency anymore. You know what I mean? So then we start to move into a world where things are happening in real time.
Yeah, and if we consider the real use case for drones maybe is more of a rural aspect. If, for example, logistically, a delivery company is trying to get a package from maybe a moving home base, a truck itself has a drone taking off, and so they're flying in rural areas or hard to get to from the ground. There's definitely some challenge there from 5G as it gains acceptance and exposure across all of these developing nations with this technology. But certainly it has high applicability in terms of these these high density areas that really need a strong communication with ground control systems.
I want to sort of carry on with that just for a second and talk a little bit more about what's going to happen in the future and where we're going with this. Up until now, we've talked about package delivery. And immediately in my mind, I think Amazon. I buy something from Amazon and it gets flown out to me in a drone. But can you think of any more use cases for this kind of technology?
Yeah, I think the primary one that I've seen up to this point is utility companies, and there's a very large and complex set of activity happening every day for utility companies in as far as inspections, and those inspections can happen both, for example, a gas pipeline. These companies employ pilots and have planes and are spending hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars even to operate these planes to fly on a daily basis to make observations on the ground. And with the growing the growing capabilities of machine learning and computer vision, a lot of these decisions can be made by computer systems and be flagged for human review. And so I think as the type of processors and the type of battery that's required to run these things can be built more and more into the drones, or as these drones stream that data back to these platforms for analysis, they can flag these things and really reduce the overhead cost burden, as well as perhaps even just environmental factors in terms of just burning fossil fuels. There's some ground to be made there. So to come back to your question, utility companies, railroad companies, really anything that requires inspection on a regular basis is very interested in the continued progression of the drone industry.
I think the craziest use case I've seen for drones to date is a film that was taken in China where a drone flew up to maybe the 20th story and put out a fire. And it was absolutely incredible. Now, I don't pretend I don't claim to know exactly how it did it, but it had some kind of fire extinguisher attached to it. It flew up there, the flames were coming out of the window. It fired off its fire extinguisher through the window, and for all intents and purposes, it looked like it extinguished the fire on a 20-story building. It was amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly in the public safety sector, drones are being utilized today, and there are many companies coming up with all kinds of, as you say, very interesting ways to apply drones, both from policing as well as fire safety, forest fire safety, all types of different things. These drones are playing an important role with these communities, and it's it's really a great boon economically to them as well, because instead of investing millions of dollars into a helicopter, for example, to make some sort of operation happen, they can invest a few $1,000s in a very high-end drone and achieve the same results with success and often better results, just because that drone is much more diverse in where it can fly and its size and those type of things.
I can see that we're starting to run out of time here, but before I let you go, I've got a couple more questions. And the first one is we've talked a lot about the technicalities around these things now. We've talked a lot about the regulation, the systems we're going to use to control that information stream between the associated stakeholders. We've talked about what needs to be in place, but what we haven't talked about is how people are reacting to this. Do you have, being in the industry the way you are, do you have any sort of sense of if people are ready for this, if they want it? I can see why it might be a huge push from industry and people that have commercial interests in this. But what about everyday people? Do you have any sort of sense if they're ready, if they want this?
Well, that's a great question. And I think if you did an informal poll on the street, you would find in almost all cases, you'll probably see three different areas. You'll have an absolutely yes, that sounds great. I'd love to have that drone drop a package down on my doorstep. You'll have the people that are absolutely no. If I see a drone, I carry a shotgun with me and I'm going to shoot it out of the sky. And then you'll find that middle ground where it's just like, well, I don't love the idea, but I can understand that this is a reality and I kind of need to wrap my head around it. And so they kind of waffle on that decision. And, I think that's probably the sentiment you'll find in any community. And so, I think a lot of the steps that we're taking is to help mitigate that, and maybe also democratize it a little bit. And I'll give you an example. One of the tools that Airspace Link provides is called Air Registry, and Air Registry is intended to be a community voice platform, so that I can come in, I can register my address, and I can say I opt in, I support this idea, or I completely opt out. And it's really one of those tools that we can provide to communities to say, hey, this is the overall sentiment in your community, and here's a region of very active and excuse me, very or folks who are not interested. So there's a cluster, and maybe we can look at ways at eliminating or reducing the number of drone flights that are flying over this particular area. And or maybe there's an area of high popularity, and so it's like, well, these are corridors that we can fly through because the people are accepting of it and they utilize the service themselves. So I think when we look at it, though, we kind of treat it as maybe you'd view the revolution from the horse to the automobile. And I think there was probably a lot of chagrin by those old cowboys who are trying to get their horses down Main Street, and these loud cars were popping and banging and rolling and driving too close to their horses. But we know that as technology got better and the efficiencies gained were viewed, then it became an accepted part of everyday use. And I think that's probably the trend we'll see with drone activity as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm sure that's the way it's going to be, and I'm also sure that this is not an isolated case. When we talk about those people, some I just can't wait to get there, and other people are I don't know if I want this yet. I'm sure that's pretty much the case with with any kind of new technology when it first comes out, because we're not sure what it's going to look like. We've been tricked before, maybe, and before we put our cross anywhere, we want to be sure. So it's just going to take people a while to get used to it, I would imagine. Okay, so my last question for you, Daniel, before you disappear, is now this is a little bit of a tricky question. So when you think of drones being a part of the urban landscape, as a day-to-day part of the urban landscape, what are we talking here? Are we talking 5 years, 10 years, 15 years time?
We're certainly within a decade. If I were to be a betting man, I would certainly put my my money on a limited but regular activity in the airspace within 5 years. So, for example, drones are doing a lot of just everyday work that perhaps either vehicles or maybe some sort of piloted air vehicles are doing today. And I think within that 10-year window is when we're going to see complete mass adoption, as well as complete automated beyond visual line of sight drone activity. So, we're well on our way. I think that I think it'll be here as part of our daily lives. We'll see drones flying in the air within the next 5 years, absolutely, on a regular basis.
I look forward to it. Daniel, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming along today and telling us a little bit more about what's happening in the space, what we can look forward to, and your company. I really appreciate that. But before we say goodbye, where can we go to follow along and learn more about your work?
Absolutely. Well, you can find Airspace Link at our web address, http://airspacelink.com. And we provide links and tools also to our air registry product, which I mentioned earlier. So if you have a need or a desire to add your voice, we'd love to have that. And we use that as a way to democratize this with local communities. So visit us on the web and follow us on all our other social media channels. You'll just find us by searching for Airspace Link.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Alrighty. Thank you. Take care.
And that's the end of another episode of the Mapscaping podcast. My name is Daniel, and I'd really like to thank you for tuning in again this week. It's much appreciated. I'd also like to take the time to remind you that if you would like to reach out to me for whatever reason, you'll find a few useful links in the show notes. I'd love to hear from you. See you next week. Bye.